Good evening and welcome to the Beaverton Thorah Eldon Historical Society YouTube page. This will be our first posting, so this will be a little bit rough around the edges. We haven't really decided where to go with the YouTube page yet, but we will figure things out. The first posting will be a recent presentation I made to the Historical Society. I've edited the video to remove some technical difficulties I had with the slideshow, and the slideshow is not particularly visible in the video itself, so all of the pictures from the slideshow will follow the presentation. So just continue watching the video to the end and you will see the slides that I had prepared. With that, off we go. Good afternoon, and thank you for that introduction, George. I'm here today to talk about the railway locally, but first I want to run down my family history to bring you up to date as to why I know so much about the railway. All right, starting with my third great-grandfather, James Hall Dickson. Don't go back. Don't. I guess it, unfortunately, it does it on its own, I guess. Starting with my third great-grandfather, James Hall Dickson was born in Lasswade, Scotland, just south of Edinburgh. He was a sawyer, and which means he worked in a sawmill. Sometime around 1850, the Caledonia Railway decided to double track its main line from Glasgow to Edinburgh. James Hall contracted to supply lumber to the railway, and that's the first railway-related family member. Of his children, his second son, or his third son, William, fourth, contracted also to the railway to supply coal, and James and Robert drove the delivery carts. Now, William is my second great-grandfather. In 1855, James Hall's mother passed away, and plans were made to move the family to Canada. In 1856, the family moved to Galt, Ontario, except for William, my second great-grandfather, who remained in Glasgow, working for the railway as a warehouse person in the Glasgow station. Upon arrival in Canada, James got a job with the Great Western Railway as a bridge guard south of Galt. His job was to patrol a bridge after a train passed, putting out any fires that the sparks from the smokestack may have started. The wood-burning locomotives at that time started a lot of fires when they passed. There's a lot of sparks came from wood stuff. Upon arrival, the rest of the family settled in the area as well, with most of them trying farming. That didn't work out for all of them, and Robert ended up being a carpenter for the Grand Trunk Railway in Buffalo. Agnes Cochrane married a butcher from Angus, opened a shop in Chatham, and had two of her sons became locomotive engineers for the Père Marquette Railroad from Detroit. The next, John Murdoch, this is my great-great-granduncle. John Murdoch Dickson tried farming, but settled for a job in the railway as a sectionman in Burlington. Upon retirement, he returned to Galt and worked the crossing gates in downtown Galt for the CNR until his death. Forget it. Matthew Cochrane, who was pictured there, moved to Hamilton and became the first manager of the Hamilton Street Railway. In 1893, he was offered and accepted the job of district passenger agent for the Grand Trunk Railway at Union Station in Toronto. He held this position until 1902, when he became station agent at Woodstock and then Brantford, retiring in Hamilton. Matthew's son, John Proctor, worked for the vice president of CPR in Ottawa and was also an executive of the Railway Accident Insurance Company in Ottawa. At the time of the silver boom in Cobalt, he purchased a small section of land from the railway and opened the right-of-way mine in Cobalt. The mine is now a museum beside the railway track in Cobalt. Returning to William, in 1867, he made the decision to join the rest of the family in Canada. Matthew got him a job as a station agent for the Great Western Railway at Stony Point, Ontario. Changing to the North and Northwestern Railway, he became station agent at Glencairn, Cookstown, Georgetown, and Stayner. While at Stayner, the North and Northwestern Railway and the GTR merged, and he then went to Phelpston, where he retired from the GTR in 1907. Several of his children continued in the railways. James Murdoch became a telegrapher for the North and Northwestern, but left and joined Western Union in Cincinnati. Marion Rogers married a Francis McCallum, a GTR station agent in Washego and then in Midland. Robert Rogers was a dispatcher for the Union Pacific Railway in Colorado, and Roger Walker was a station agent and customs agent in North Portal, Saskatchewan with the Canadian Pacific Railway. William Roger, my great-grandfather, started by piling wood by the track, helping his father in Stayner. This is his service record, and he finished as operator at Allendale, then Colwell, Kirkfield, Woodville, Lornville, and Utah, and then retired at Omini. You see, he worked for the GTR until 1892 when he resigned and joined the CPR. After being moved around too much by the CPR and getting married in Plantagenet, he returned to the GTR. My great uncle was born upon arrival in Kirkfield. They weren't, this building wasn't ready for them to move into in Kirkfield at the station. It was a house as well as the station. So they had to stay in the Campbell Hotel in Kirkfield. And my great uncle was born on the couch in the front lobby of the Campbell Hotel. So his name is James William Campbell Dickson. My great uncle was born in Kirkfield, and my grandfather was born upon arrival in Woodville. When they moved from Kirkfield to Woodville, she was pregnant, and the train bounced her around so much that she gave birth when she arrived in Woodville. My grandmother contracted, I guess she's my great-grandmother, sorry, contracted tuberculosis, and the doctor suggested the air was better for her health in Lornville, so they transferred there. She passed away she passed away in Lornville, and William was left to raise 4 kids on his own while operating long hours in a railway station. His mother-in-law and his sister stopped by to help as much as possible, but stress led to drinking for William. The railway, in order to save embarrassment, moved him to a remote station in Utah. At that time it was remote because all it was a gravel pit, and the trains went into the gravel pit, picked up gravel and left, and so the station was right at the gravel pit. While they lived in Lornville, my great uncle had a great time writing stories of him growing up, and one of the stories he talked about was in 1920, 10 years before the Welland Canal was open, heavy grain shipments moved from Midland to Lindsay through Lornville Junction. The Blackwater-Cobeconk branch crossed the Midland-Lindsay line at this point. The diamond was protected by semaphores a quarter mile from the station. Each semaphore was controlled by cable, which was wound onto a drum to put the signal in go position. Changed to stop, the cable was let out by kicking a release cog. One fall day, the agent at Lornville heard the telegraph key chatter, a message that a freight train was leaving Lindsay from Midland. To be sure that the signal was clear, he went to the station platform to check. The chain was wound tight on the drum, the signal arm was straight up, and the light was green. A few minutes later, the train whistled repeatedly. The agent heard it, but knowing the signal was clear, he thought of cattle on the track or some other reason for the whistling. A few minutes later, the train crawled slowly up to the station. The conductor and engineer came into the office and expressed their views on being stopped for no apparent reason. The agent insisted that the signal was clear and accompanied the crew outside to prove his point. But the signal arm was straight out and the light was red. He glanced for an explanation and saw the curly-tailed end of a pig disappearing around the corner of the station house. He said to the conductor, "Maybe the pig did it." Snorting in disgust, the conductor highballed his train and spread the word along the line that the agent at Lornville had lost some of his marbles. A week later, the agent called his son to the station window to bear witness with him. Over in the Y, his potatoes had been harvested, but little ones had been cast aside. The family pig was rooting them out and gorging himself. When he completed his meal, he crossed the tracks and trotted along the platform, headed for home. But for a moment he deviated. He moved inquisitively to the signal lever and drum, thrust his snout into the blob of axle grease on the release cog, then scuttled for his pin and safely behind the house. As the drum spun, the cable ran out with a clatter, and the signal jolted from go to stop.
Yeah.
All right. And there is a picture. This is my great uncle, James William Campbell Dickson. He's playing on a baggage cart at Laurenville, and that's the Laurenville station. Go back. That's the Laurenville station, and these are the semaphore arms. Now, this one's right in front of the station. If the line's up like that, the train just passes through, no problem. When the arms are down, the train has to stop. If the train comes and it's at a 45-degree angle, that's slow. The train has to pass the station, it's slow. And the station agent uses that message hoop over there to pass messages to the engineer and the conductor as the train goes by. If it's something really important, they stop the train. Because this is a diamond right here, one track goes this way and one track goes that way. In order to enter through the diamond, there are semaphores farther down that would control whether or not they had to stop for the diamond. And that's probably the one that
So that's a westbound from Midland?
it's probably, I don't know for sure which one that is, because I don't remember how the station was oriented. I only was there once when the station was actually there, and I was only this big. But that is a CN train. Yeah. And then the railway line. I don't know what picture that was, so it's that one here. That's my great uncle Jim later in life. Alrighty. Two of the sons from my great grandfather followed him into the railway. James William Campbell, who you just saw, started with Canadian National in their Toronto headquarters, and when that was moved to Montreal, he moved as well. He served in CN headquarters for 44 years and 9 months. He was the one who started researching the family tree, and I took it over after his death. And as you can see, that's his life, 29. He started in Toronto, and then they moved the headquarters to Montreal. This is my grandfather, Thomas Soames Spall, who 42 years ago next month did a similar presentation here.
Okay.
And that's a newspaper article there of him being here 42 years ago. And there's a copy of his speech there. And he spoke extensively about the local railway because he knew it. And he started in 1927 in the Omini station, where his father was station agent. And he started as a caretaker in Omini, working with his dad, and then he took this picture of the Omini station in 1927. And his first big visit to Beaverton East was in 1928. The station agent had a house beside the station, but my grandfather stayed at the Ontario Hotel on Main Street on the main street where the discount store is now. He walked to the station over wooden sidewalks every day. After relieving agents at many locations for their vacations, he was laid off during the Depression. At this time, he started driving truck for Mackey Transport, and you've probably seen lots of Mackey Transport trucks going by now. One of his regular deliveries was to Port Hope, where he would meet boats from the U.S. His freight was apples. Yeah. He would collect the money from the Americans for the apples and then deposit the money in the Port Hope Bank. All went smoothly until a new bank manager arrived and questioned why Mr. Dickson always deposited such a large sum of money to Mackey's account. It seems the apples were not apples at all, but alcohol destined for the use during Prohibition. In 1940, he returned to the railway just in time to enlist in the Army for World War II in 1941. This is a picture of him in the Second World War. In support of the war effort, all the railways promised anyone serving overseas would have a job when they returned. My grandfather served with the Canadian Railway Operating Group, whose job it was to repair the railways and the equipment destroyed by war, so supply lines stayed open. He was quartermaster, and his office was in a boxcar. And as you can see, this is in a boxcar. He said it was full of bullet holes.
Oh, great.
After the war, he returned to CNR, and in 1950 was posted back to Beaverton. Now, this picture here is of the station in Beaverton, the Beaverton East Station, but at this time, it was just Beaverton. So this is when it was a Grand Trunk station. It was still owned by Grand Trunk. This is the station, the freight shed, and this White House right here was the sectionman's house, and it's still there. It's right on the corner of Mare Road and Lakeland Crescent.
Now, the freight shed was between the station and
the road.
the road.
Yeah, the road is just back between here and there. And you'll see
I
that.
remember when it was moved. I didn't see the moving, but
This is a 1950s picture of the Beaverton East Station, which was when my grandfather would have been there. This was a grain elevator that belonged to Dobson. And the house,
that was moved there later.
there's three of them. You'll see in a later map, there's three grain stations.
But that building used to be on where Bullocks are.
There was three of them.
Yeah, there was two. The Doherty's was on one side of the old tracks, and
Yeah.
this one was on the north side. And my uncle helped move it. He drove the horse on the windlass to move it.
And this is my grandfather, and this side of the building faced Mare Road. And that's my grandfather and my brother. And you can see right here the crossing on Mare Road. And the freight shed is here. And this line went right through Vivine's property. That picture was my grandmother sitting in front of the house that's still there. The operator's house is still there in the same location it was too. But since it won't play, we can't see it. That's it there anyway. This was my parents. In 1959, the station was closed and demolished in 1960. The station master's house is still there, and the section man's house is also still there. My mother was born and raised in Beaverton and met and married my dad in 1953. Dan joined the CNR and trained to be a signal maintainer. Training started on the rail work gangs in Northern Ontario. After passing his training, he was able to apply for territories as they came open, finally making it back to Beaverton in 1962. His territory was Washago to Mount Albert, and he retired in 1990. The next picture doesn't show up. That's my dad standing in front of a steam locomotive that came through Beaverton in 1968, 6213, which is this locomotive right here in this picture. That locomotive. since that one won't come back. This is a picture of me. I worked for Go Transit for 5 years in the finance department. Then for 5 years, from 2012 to 2017, I was the first manager of the Toronto Railway Museum. Prior to becoming manager, I had volunteered with the Toronto Railway Historical Association and helped build the museum. This is a picture of me in the cab of one of the museum's artifacts, a 1953 GP7 locomotive, number 4803, donated to the City of Toronto by CN Rail. These locomotives were built by GM in their London, Ontario plant. The full locomotive looks like that. And there's a model of it right there. This is the front end. Most locomotives you see now, this would be the front end, and they look that way. These were made to look like the steam engines. The engineers were used to seeing a long nose in front of them, so these were made long nose forward.
Bob, when did they switch over from diesel electric from coal or wood or whatever they used?
Pretty much by the end of 1959, most coal
Were gone.
locomotives were gone,
Oh, okay.
and the diesels were in. And as he said, they are diesel electric. There's a huge 12-cylinder locomotive engine in here that powers a generator. The generator sends electricity to the wheels. So that's how diesel engines work. Okay. Now to talk about the railway a little bit in Beaverton. In 1971, the Port Hope, Lindsay and Beaverton Railway built a station at the end of the line in Beaverton. There was a turntable here, and the locomotives would be turned so they could push backwards the train down to the lake. Then once loaded, would head back to south to Port Hope. The ships docking in Beaverton did not carry much cargo, so it was decided to continue the line to Midland to meet the bigger Great Lakes ships. Now this map shows the location of the station would be in this, right in the Y here. The original line went down to the lake. After 2 years, they had completed to Midland, so they cut this one off right there and continued Victoria Street down over that line. If you look on Google Maps, right at the end of Victoria Street, you can see a line of pylons going out into the lake. I assume they are from the wharf, but I've never seen a picture of the wharf, so I don't know. The only picture we have here of the wharf shows a little tiny piece of it. So, and this was the turntable here, so they would turn them and then back them down there.
You can still see evidence in the line.
Yeah.
If you're walking.
Yeah,
or-
and you can still see this curve here. Goes right back behind the school and through Lakeland Crescent is just the other side of it, and Bullocks is here. And then this is the only picture of the turntable.
Didn't work too well, that
The
did.
track is there, and the turntable pit is there, and this train is lying on its side. And that's one of the Midland trains, belongs to the Midland Railway. This is a 1910 map of the location. This is the sectionman's house here, which is still there. There were 2 grain elevators there, and this grain elevator here. So there were 3 grain elevators. This was the freight shed with the platform, and the station was here. The water tower was over here. Now I assume, because I don't know for sure, that the turntable was in this location as well somewhere. And this is the station operator's house, which is still there. And this is in 1906, the Canadian Northern Railway came into Beaverton, and in 1918, the Canadian government acquired it after it bankrupted. This is a picture of them building the bridge for the Canadian Northern over the Beaver River. And this is the completed bridge. renamed CNR when the takeover of the GTR was finished. The Midland and GTR station under CNR was renamed to Beaverton East, and the CNR station was just called Beaverton. Although I've heard it called Beaverton West, I've never seen documentation supporting that. And the final picture, the CNR station. Now this is the one that was at the end of King Street. You can see a baggage cart here, and this little thing here is called a velocipede. It's a wooden bicycle that you rode on the track. And it had a little outrigger at the side for the third wheel. And that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
There is a nice picture of that station right over there,
Yes.
on the wall,
Yes.
same station.